All the Young Dudes. Sirius's Perspective by Roller Coaster Words. Chapter 107. 6th Year. The Big Bad Wolf. Sunday the 15th of January, 1977. Sleep did nothing to cool his anger. If anything, it made it worse. Sirius woke the next morning with rage calcified like bone in his chest. He slammed the bathroom door shut, brushed his teeth until his gums bled, spat blood down the drain of the shower. His magic crackled just beneath the surface of his skin, and he nearly singed his eyebrows off when he used the heating charm to dry his hair. When he stormed back into their room, scowling, James shot him a reproachful look. "Come on, mate. Moony's sleeping." "I don't care," Sirius growled, yanking his school robes out of his wardrobe and slamming the door shut. James tutted. "Right, let's go down to the common room, then. Come on." "I don't want to go down to the—" "Black." James was frowning at him, arms crossed and brows raised, in an expression that was painfully reminiscent of euphemia. Sirius deflated slightly. "Fine," he grumbled, grabbing his school bag off the floor and casting one last furious glare back at the drawn curtains around Remus's bed before stomping down the stairs after James. The common room was mostly empty, just a few fifth years in the corner, talking quietly about a transfiguration essay. Peter was already sitting near the fireplace, setting up his chessboard. He glanced up when they walked through the door. "Oh, you got him to come down." James smiled tightly, and Sirius's scowl deepened. Peter gulped and turned quickly back to his chess game. Sirius began to pace in front of the fireplace, magic still buzzing in his blood. He wanted to smash something. James, settling down in the armchair across from Peter, frowned as if he could sense Sirius's thoughts. "You're right there, mate." "No," Sirius spat, whirling. He didn't understand how his friends could be so calm. "I can't believe he bloody left like that." James nodded sympathetically, moving a pawn absent-mindedly on the board. Peter's eyes lit up, like he knew he'd already won. "I mean, it was a right shitty thing to do, going off on his own. What the hell did he think he was playing at?" "I know, mate," James said, watching Peter move a bishop. "We were all worried." "And then just going to sleep. Not even fucking talking to us." "Check!" Peter shouted gleefully. Sirius spun on him, glaring. "Shut up, Peter. Nobody cares about your stupid obsession with chess." "Oi," James said sharply, as Peter shrank back. "Well, it's true. He's acting like nothing even happened." "I was worried too," Peter protested defensively. "Well, you aren't fucking acting like it. Just because I'm not ready to bite his head off, he could have been hurt. He could have, yeah, but he wasn't." Peter was glaring down at the chessboard, lip trembling slightly. "He's fine, so I don't see why you're still in such a state over it. There's no need to be so bloody angry. You do stupid shit all the time, and none of us ever blow up at you for it." Sirius scoffed, spluttering. It's not. "Look, both of you, just stop," James interrupted, taking off his glasses to rub at his eyes. He replaced them and gave them both a stern look. In the corner, the fifth years had stopped whispering and were now staring over curiously. "Black, you need to calm down," James said, catching his eye. "We're all upset, but Pete's right. Remus is fine. We can talk to him once he's woken up, but for now, shouting at each other isn't going to make anything better." Sirius huffed, turning back to the fireplace. He knew he was being a prick, but what else was he supposed to do with the choking, angry words that crowded onto the back of his tongue? Peter's voice echoed in the back of his head. "There's no need to be so bloody angry." It was normal to be angry, wasn't it? Remus had betrayed them, had risked his life over something stupid, a reckless urge, had made Sirius feel like he was losing his mind, crawling out of his skin with anxiety. Did the others not feel like this? Was he really the only one? "You know why," said a small voice in the back of his head. "It's because you're—" Remus burst through the door to the common room, hair still damp from a shower. He hesitated in the doorway, blanching as he looked at them, then turned and began to walk briskly towards the portrait hole. "Moony, wait!" James called out, and they all stood, trailing him into the corridor. Remus continued to walk quickly, taking advantage of his long stride to stay ahead of them. "I'm going to the owlery," he said flatly. "Don't you want breakfast?" Peter chewed his lip, trotting slightly to keep up. "After." "Moony, can we just talk about what happened last night?" James asked, a pleading note to his voice. "Not here." "Oh, of course not." Sirius scowled at the taller boy's back, shoving his hands into his pockets. Of course Remus would try to avoid them, to shut them out. just like he always did. Well, tough bloody luck, Sirius thought, as they followed him into the owlery. You're not getting away from me. From us. Fortunately, the owlery was empty. Who are you writing to? Sirius demanded, crossing his arms and frowning severely as Remus selected an owl. The other boy sighed, staring down at a bird's leg as he tried to attach the note to it. Virox, me old professor. Why? The string slipped out of Remus's fingers. He clucked his tongue and bent to pick it up. He's in Hogsmeade. I saw him last night, and I want to see him again. What was he doing in... Remus dropped the string again, making a small, frustrated noise as he tried for a third time to tie his note to the owl's leg. The bird ruffled its feathers impatiently, hooting. He's working with Moody. He's got summoned here to bring me back. Summoned by who? Fucking hell, could you give me a minute? Remus whirled around, glaring at him. Sirius stepped back, feeling as though he'd just been slapped, and had to bite his tongue to keep himself from screaming. Fuck you, Remus Lupin, he thought furiously. James reached out, placing a steadying hand on his shoulder, but Sirius felt like he could crawl out of his skin. Finally, Remus managed to get his note attached, and the bird took off towards the village. He sighed, turning back to the other boys, and said casually, Okay, breakfast? Are you going to tell... Yes, Padfoot. Fine. Let's get some toast first. Go for a walk or something, okay? Nobody protested, and they walked in tense silence to the great hall. Sirius's stomach was too knotted to eat. He watched as Remus took his time, buttering 5 slices of toast and wrapping them in napkins to stuff down the pockets of his robes, trying not to wince as he thought about the way the butter would almost certainly leak through the thin paper and get all over his robes. He remained silent as they left the hall, following Remus once more. This time, he led them outside. Right. He turned, finally, to face them. You all need to shut up and let me tell it to you, okay? No interruptions. Sirius's mouth twisted, but he did remain silent. Remus walked as he spoke, and they all listened. I took the cloak, he said, down to the tunnel, Dunny Jukes. I knew there was a werewolf in Hogsmeade. I smelled her on Christmas Eve. I didn't know if she'd still be there. Not for sure, but I had a feeling. Anyway, she was, and I followed her. A scent, and I found her, outside the Hogshead. Or she found me, I suppose. I don't really know. Anyway, we just talked. She could use magic, wandless magic, but she didn't hurt me. Well, he paused, glancing down at the bandage on his arm. I mean, not really. She was part of Greyback's pack. The one who... He trailed off, taking a breath. She said she wanted me to join them, their family. She kept calling him our father, but He swallowed again, and Sirius clenched his hands into fists to stop his fingers from trembling. I told her I wasn't going to. And then Virox showed up, and he conjured these chains, silver, and she left, disapparated, just like that. Remus hesitated for a moment, then continued, voice low as he said, Moody talked to me last summer. He said something to me, and it just made me think about how useful I can be, is all. I've to stop looking at my furry little problem as a problem. If we're going to war with dark creatures, then as a dark creature I ought to be... You're not a dark creature, James interrupted abruptly. You're our Moony. Remus ducked his head, shrugging. He rifled around in his pockets for a moment and withdrew a pack of cigarettes. Look at me, Sirius thought, staring at him. He tried to picture Moony sat across from one of the rickety beer-stained tables at the Hogshead, listening to another werewolf tell him Greyback was their father. Sirius could tell from the pauses, the small hesitations, that there were things Remus wasn't telling them, details he was leaving out. Fucking look at me. So, James said, when it became apparent that Remus was done speaking. She's gone now, has she? The werewolf? Olivia, the other boy muttered, sticking a fag between his teeth. Yeah, I think Virox scared her off. Too bloody right, James nodded, relaxing slightly. And I bet with Moody on the case, she won't be back any time soon, eh? So, are you lot in trouble? With Dumbledore? Well, I don't think so. Remus rubbed at his hip, frowning. I think Dumbledore was more worried about me mucking up his spy ring rather than breaking any rules. He wouldn't want to see any of you hurt. Any of us." James spoke earnestly, as if he really truly believed it, and Sirius thought of the scars on his legs, Moony's bandages, after full moons, Regulus laughing that cold, bitter laugh. "Come on," James nodded towards the lake. "There's a bench down there. You can finish your toast." They walked slowly to the edge of the water, pausing when they reached the stone benches. The grounds were empty. Nobody wanted to come outside in the freezing weather, and besides it was a Sunday morning. Half the castle was probably still in bed. Nobody spoke as they sat, James munching on an apple he'd snagged from the hall, Moony chewing his toast. Sirius kicked at the frozen ground beneath his feet, nudging the splinters of ice around with the toe of his shoe. Peter and James both seemed completely at ease, now that they knew what had happened, satisfied with the knowledge that nothing too dreadful had occurred, and Remus was safe. Sirius, decidedly, was not satisfied. The anger continued to prowl in his chest, snarling and lashing its tail. "Can't believe we all slept through the most exciting night of the year, eh?" James smiled, nudging Remus in an attempt to lighten the mood. "It wasn't that exciting." Remus smiled crookedly. "I was crap. If Ferox hadn't come, I don't know." "Do you think she could have disapparated with you?" Peter asked, blinking nervously and shivering in the cold. "I don't know," Remus shrugged. I got the impression, anyway, that she needed me to agree. Like it had to be me who made the decision. Otherwise, I suppose they could all just gang up and snatch me." "Well then," James perked up, looking properly relieved. "There's no problem, is there? Well, I mean, there's no question." No, of course not," Remus agreed quickly. "I'd never join Greyback." "Well then," James patted the other boy's leg, as if that settled the matter. Remus swallowed, looking down at his hands, and Sirius stared at him, at the small, grim twist of his mouth. His brow was furrowed, lip poking out, in that familiar expression that meant he was thinking. "Moony?" James asked quietly. "I'd never join him," Remus said slowly. "And Livia she was awful, but—" He paused, taking a breath. "Not everything she said was wrong." Sirius couldn't stop himself from raising his voice slightly as he snapped, "What is that supposed to mean?" Remus continued to stare stubbornly at the ground, refusing to meet his eye. "Look at me, you bloody coward, look at me. Just look at me." "Just that, well, wizards treat us unfairly, and, you lot wouldn't understand." "Well, of course they wouldn't bloody understand. Not if Remus wouldn't fucking talk to them. Wouldn't even try to—" Sirius realised that he had stood up, without meaning to. He glared down at Remus, wanting to scream at him, to grab his robes and shake him, to pull him to his feet, and... Sirius spun around, storming off across the grounds before he could do something that he would regret. His blood was boiling, magic hissing like steam in his fingers. "Black!" he heard James shouting behind him. "Oi!" Sirius ignored him and kept walking. He didn't know where he was going. He just had to get away. James caught up to him at the edge of the Quidditch pitch, chasing after him as he marched onto the field, icy snow crunching under their feet. "Padfoot!" he huffed, breath steaming in the wintry air. "Hang on!" Sirius slumped down in the lower seats of the Quidditch stands, crossing his arms and shivering. "You should at least start jogging with me again, mate, if you're going to try and outrun me. I'm not in the mood, Prongs." "Oh no, I can see that." They were quiet for a minute. Then, "Well," James sighed. "Go on then, let's have it out. What are you so upset about now?" That was all it took. "He lied to me, James," Sirius burst out. "He said we'd do it together, and then he just went off by himself. He didn't even tell me." He broke off, appalled to find that familiar lump was developing in his throat, tears prickling at the backs of his eyes. James tilted his head, staring up at the goalposts. "Have you considered that he was doing it to protect you?" "What?" "Going without you. Have you considered that maybe he didn't want to put you at risk?" "Oh, fuck that," Sirius growled. "He could have been hurt, James, and we wouldn't even have realised, but he wasn't." "Yeah, but he could have, but he wasn't." James was watching him, infuriatingly calm, and Sirius scowled, kicking the seat in front of him again. When he didn't speak, James released another sigh, running a hand through his hair. "Look, mate, what's this really about?" Sirius glanced up at him sharply. What's that supposed to mean? You're pissed off that he left you. I get it. I'd be angry too. But everything turned out all right. So, what's going on? Why hold it against him? Sirius frowned. Typical fucking Potter. James didn't seem to be able to fathom why anyone would hold a grudge against their friends if they could just forgive and forget. He stayed quiet for a bit, glaring sullenly at his feet. James waited patiently, leaning back in his seat, eyes unwavering. There was something about that placid, unhurried gaze. Eventually, Sirius caved. He hesitated, fiddling with his fingers before looking up. I thought he trusted me. Prongs. James nodded, slowly, sympathy washing over his features. Sirius swallowed, looking back down. Over Christmas, we got closer, and I thought he was, opening up to me a bit, confiding in me. He huffed a laugh, shaking his head. It sounds silly when I say it out loud. Nah, James smiled. Doesn't sound silly at all, actually. Sirius nodded, still fidgeting with his fingers, trying to swallow that awful lump in his throat. It's like he's always pulling away. Do you know what I mean? Like something will happen and I'll think, this is it. He trusts me now. We're finally on the same page, and then something else will happen, and suddenly it's like I'm trying to talk to a brick wall. I don't know. Now that he was talking, the words kept spilling out of him, a great rush of feeling that Sirius hadn't even realised he'd bottled up. And I hate it, because I know I don't even deserve his trust, Not after last spring, but I still want it. And it's selfish, I know, but I can't. Sirius broke off again, shaking his head helplessly. He didn't know how to put it into words without telling James everything, without breaking down, without sobbing until the tears froze on his face, saying he doesn't care about me, not the way I care about him. Even thinking it made him feel pathetic, dirty, tainted. James reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder, squeezing. I know, mate, he said, quietly. I get it. You don't, Sirius thought miserably. You really, really don't, and if you did, you would never look at me the same. Next to him, James blew out a breath. He turned to Sirius, still smiling. Real man of mystery, our Moony, eh? Sirius stared back at him helplessly. What am I supposed to do, Prongs? He asked, trying to stave off the desperation that wanted to creep into his voice. If I mucked it all up again. James's smile faltered slightly as he took in the expression on his friend's face, but he said, firmly, No, Padfoot, you haven't mucked it up at all. We're all used to your outbursts by now, you silly sod. Moony more than anyone, probably. He paused for a moment, thinking. You can't force him to confide in you all the time. If there are things he needs to work through on his own, well, you can't be there for everything. Sometimes you just have to give him space. Sirius stared out at the iced-over Quidditch pitch, bleak and grey in the cold. Yeah, he mumbled slowly. Suppose you're right. James grinned, clapping him on the back as he climbed to his feet. Always am, aren't I? Now, come on. I know you didn't grab anything at breakfast. Let's go raid the kitchens, yeah? Chapter 108. 6th Year, Space. Friday the 5th of February, 1977. Sirius Black could do space. Space was fine if that's what Remus needed, if that was what he wanted. Who cared about a little bit of distance? Not Sirius, not one bit. As the last few weeks of January slipped away, he didn't touch Remus once. No more broom cupboards, no more empty classrooms, no more late-night rendezvous. Sirius kept his hands to himself. It was difficult, more difficult than it should have been, but he knew it was necessary. James had been right. He couldn't force Remus to confide in him. He couldn't force Remus to care about him, to feel the same things he was feeling. It was all good fun, their arrangement, but only if Sirius could keep his emotions in check. Only if he could keep the messy, tangled snarl of feelings from cracking like an eggshell, spilling out between them, covering Remus in their muck. It wasn't fair to demand something more when Sirius knew that wasn't what Moony wanted. some level of closeness that Remus couldn't possibly give. It would be wrong of him. It would ruin everything. So he gave Moony space. It became apparent very quickly that this was the right decision. Remus relaxed into his normal routine, spending all his time studying in the library or reading quietly by the fireplace. He seemed calmer than he had in weeks, and Sirius felt sick with the thought that he must have been crowding him, overwhelming him, throwing himself at Remus when all the other boy wanted was to be left alone. "He'll come back," a small, selfish part of him whispered. "When he's ready, he'll come back to you." Sirius clung to the pathetic hope that it stirred, lying awake at night, wishing desperately that he could hear the soft shuffle of footsteps, the rustle of bed curtains, that just once Remus would come to him. But he didn't. And as the days wore on, Sirius was forced to confront with the possibility that he hadn't wanted to consider. That Remus wouldn't come to him. That he never would. That it was over. It shouldn't have mattered. Sirius knew that. It shouldn't have hurt, not the way that it did, like a wound that wouldn't heal, a dull, throbbing ache in his chest. He had always known that this would happen, eventually, that Moony would get sick of him, would call it quits, would sense that it wasn't quite so casual for Sirius, not anymore, and pull back, appalled or frightened or angry, would want things to return to normal. That was fine. That was for the best. Sirius remembered Mary's words on the day they broke up. "Sometimes it's like your feelings are so big that there isn't room for anyone else's." He'd let his feelings get too big, again, without stopping to think about what Remus wanted, what Remus needed. Of course things had fallen apart. All he ever seemed to do was repeat the same mistakes. So, space. Clearly, that was what Remus wanted from him, and that was what Sirius would give. He began watching James's Quidditch practices again, and threw himself into brainstorming new pranks. He raided the kitchens with Peter, and smoked in the greenhouses with Mary when she was in the mood, and returned to his relationship with Emmeline with a renewed focus, determined to get at least one thing right. He walked her to class and carried her book bag, and snuck up to the astronomy tower with her, and when he kissed her, he thought of only her size, and her soft hands, and her floral perfume, and definitely not anything else. By the time February full moon rolled around, things almost felt normal. Remus insisted that they stay inside the shack, so there were no late-night runs through the forest, but that was perfectly fine. None of the marauders were going to push him outside if he didn't want to, not after what had happened the previous month. On the way back to Gryffindor Tower, James had the rather brilliant idea to conjure bright red wings onto all of the portraits. He was nattering on about Evans again, saying something or other about the vermilion magnificence of her hair, but Sirius couldn't be bothered to pay much attention to that part. He just thought it might be a laugh. Instead of bothering to try and snatch a few minutes of sleep before classes, they'd be tired either way, the two boys pored over books on magical portraiture in the common room, while Peter passed out on the couch beside them. They decided to proceed with their plan after lunch. Sirius took the invisibility cloak, since, they reasoned, James always had his shiny prefect's badge to fall back on. He was on the third-floor mezzanine, sweet-talking one of the Shire paintings of a sea nymph, and was just about to try and cast the spell, when a voice rang out behind him. "Padfoot!" When he turned, Remus was there, grinning as he tramped up the stairs. The sea nymph gave a little shriek, diving immediately into the gentle waves beneath her rock. "Aw, Moony, what'd you scare her off for?" Sirius shook his head. "I was just about to try and cast a spell." "This is brilliant," Remus gushed, eyes bright as he waved a hand back towards the portraits that Sirius had already finished. "How come you never told me you were doing it? Is James on it?" "Yeah, he's taking the East Wing." Sirius willed his traitorous heart to stop pounding, keeping his voice casual as he turned to the next painting. "We just had the idea walking back up to bed this morning. Sorry, thought you'd be sleeping still. Madame Pomfrey let me go." "Oh, right. You'll probably want to go to the library then, or something. I'm nearly finished here. No need to stick around." "No, Oh, shit!" Of course, the hallway's grandfather clock began to chime just at that moment. In a few seconds, every single door would burst open, spilling students into the corridor as they hurried off to their next lesson. "They'll know it's us," Sirius hissed. "Quick!" He yanked the invisibility cloak from under his robes and raised it up without thinking. Remus rushed over and ducked his head, crouching to make sure they both fit. The two boys backed against the wall, where they could do nothing but wait as doors to every classroom slammed open, expelling a flood of black-robed students. Sirius tried to breathe evenly, all too aware of the boy squashed next to him. This, most definitely, was not space. "Oi," Remus whispered, breathing hot against Sirius's ear. Merlin, he was weak. He was so weak. This is going to ruin everything. Are you still angry with me? Sirius blinked. What are you... You're avoiding me. What? No, I'm not. A third-year girl walked past, a bit too close for comfort. Sirius was forced to push even further back, so that Remus's chest was pressed flush against him, and fuck, he'd forgotten just how tall Moony was. James said to give you space, he said quietly, and you left me out of the Hogshead mission, even after we said we'd go together. It wasn't a mission, Remus whispered, voice rising slightly, taut with frustration. The students around them were now beginning to notice the portraits, with their enormous curly red wings, and a low buzz of laughter started up through the hall. Remus spoke directly into his ear. I never agreed we'd go together. Well, it sent the message that you wanted space. Sirius shuffled around, turning so that he could hiss into Remus's ear too. Merlin, they were close, and he was so warm. Sirius wasn't sure if he wanted to shove him away or wrap his arms around his neck and snog him. I'm sorry, okay? Remus muttered. I didn't think you'd take it so hard. I'm not taking it hard, Sirius scoffed, offended. You make it sound like what? Fuck this, Sirius thought. Fuck getting caught. He didn't care, he just needed to get away, to step out from under the stifling cloak, to run from the insidious heat of that beautiful, infuriating boy in front of him, and then Remus kissed him. Finally, Sirius thought, and then he was kissing back, hands fisting in Moony's jumper, tongue swiping across his bottom lip, bones turning to jelly as he leaned forwards. Fuck, I've missed you. The students around them slowly filtered out until the corridor was empty once more. Sirius pulled back, head spinning. So now you like me again, he muttered, trying to stifle the elated thrills of pleasure running up and down his spine. Can't bloody well keep up with you. What are you talking about? You were avoiding me. I thought you wanted me to. Well, yeah, okay, I did. But not until we'd at least talked. I really don't see what there is to talk about. Sirius shoved away, ripping off the cloak. We're either doing, or we're not. You either want me, or you don't. Remus was staring at him, cheeks flushed, eyes dark. If Sirius wasn't careful, he thought he might melt into a puddle, right on the stone floor. So, he took a step back. Space was good. Which is it? Remus licked his lips. Well, it's a bit unfair to ask me that right now. Sirius's heart stuttered painfully in his chest. Remus Lupin, he thought helplessly. You're going to be the death of me. But in that moment, he couldn't bring himself to care. Come on then, he nodded towards the staircase, turning. I'm bunking off divination. Dorm's empty. Sunday, the 13th of February, 1977. And just like that, Remus wanted him again. Sirius tried not to feel too pathetic about how quickly he sank back into their old routine, crawling into Moony's bed at night, hands gravitating towards him of their own accord, bunking off class just so that he could catch the other boy in the common room, alone. All those weeks of space had apparently done nothing to quell the turbulent desire that he felt whenever Remus so much as glanced his way. If anything, it had made things worse. But that was fine. Sirius knew exactly where he'd gone wrong the first time round. What it came down to was the feelings. He just had to be more careful, work harder to keep himself at arm's length, metaphorically speaking, of course. As long as he didn't allow himself to become too intense, too demanding, too overwhelming, then everything would be fine. Remus wouldn't have any reason to pull away again. So Sirius locked away the quiet longing, the emotion that crept down his throat and into his lungs. He stamped out the spark of desire to be closer, the nebulous insistence on more. After 6 years, he had learned that it was best to take what you could get from Remus, and if what he could get was willingness, well, then that was enough. There was no use wishing that Moony would kiss him again, or reach out to him, or come to his bed just once. That line had already been drawn in the sand, and Sirius knew better than to hope that Remus would ever cross it. Besides, as long as he was allowed to kiss Remus, well, there was nothing much to complain about. In the following weeks, things returned mostly to the way they had been before. Of course, Sirius wasn't silly enough to hope that this would last, this time around. Eventually, Remus would move on. Eventually, he would get a girlfriend. Eventually, he would find someone that he actually wanted to be close with, and they'd call things off. And it would have all been good fun. Nothing more. Sirius tried not to think about it too much, to just enjoy what they had while they had it, even as he braced himself for the inevitable return to space. It would be fine. He had Emmeline, after all. It wasn't like he'd be alone. At least, that's what he told himself. Valentine's Day that year fell on a Monday, and, as Hogsmeade fell on the Saturday before, most couples celebrated it on the 12th. Sirius was no exception. He took Emmeline to the Three Broomsticks and lavished her with gifts, and spent a properly romantic evening in the astronomy tower. Emmeline was lovely, sweet and eager, and always beautiful and coy and alluring. It didn't matter. She did absolutely nothing to quell the burst of heat that unfurled in his stomach when Sirius returned to the dorm room afterwards and saw Remus smoking on the windowsill. There wasn't time that night. Remus went straight to bed, falling asleep before Sirius could even finish brushing his teeth. And they spent the next morning with James and Peter in the common room, playing Exploding Snap and listening to James recount the story of Lily Evans's Valentine's Day Hogsmeade rejection. So it wasn't until mid-afternoon, when the other boys adjourned to the library to revise for their upcoming Muggle Studies exam, that Sirius was finally able to get Moony alone. "Fancy a fag?" he asked casually, clearing away the cards. Remus looked up from the book he was reading, distracted. Oh, yeah, sure." Sirius didn't have a single cigarette to his name, but it didn't matter. They both knew that wasn't why he'd asked. The moment the door shut behind them, Sirius was tugging off Moony's jumper, pulling him onto the bed, kissing him hard enough to bruise. They began to fumble with the buttons of Remus's shirt, breathing into his neck, inhaling the familiar scent, the smoky, sweet smell of burnt sugar, the shallow earthiness of parchment, the tang of citrus. Citrus? He paused. He sniffed again. Yes, definitely citrus. And something else, something crisp and sweet and familiar. Is that... That smells like... He shoved his nose into the pillow, inhaling. Mary's perfume. Yeah, Remus said slowly. He had just taken off his shirt and was still holding it in his hands as he studied Sirius's face. She was here. Yesterday. Here. Yesterday. In Moony's bed. His head had gone fuzzy, like it was stuffed with cotton. Oh, right. You and her? Well, it was just a one-off sort of thing. Is that okay? Yeah, Sirius responded immediately. He thought of Mary with her sunny smile, her sultry curves, and her soft, sweet moans. It was doing something funny to him, imagining her on top of Remus, straddling his hips. Yeah, of course. Good for you, mate. He wasn't sure what to do with the spill of heat that spread through him, nor the kick of panic that accompanied it, as he thought of Mary's easy confidence compared to his desperate, needy fumbling. Remus must have seen the expression on his face, because he said carefully, I know you two were... but that was ages ago now, and you with Emmeline, so... Of course, Sirius nodded earnestly. I'm pleased for you, honestly. Mary's great. Yeah, she is. His thoughts tangled together, impossible to unpick. But that meant Remus was... he'd found... he'd had... he wouldn't need... wouldn't want... and Mary was so much... she was... In front of him, Remus shifted awkwardly, shirt still clutched in his fingers. He began to pull back, and Sirius's eyes snapped to his face as the rushing torrent of all his thoughts narrowed onto one burning point. No, he thought deliriously. You're not getting away. Sirius leaned forward, shoving down the horrible tangle of anxiety in his gut, focusing instead on the heat. Remus was still here, now. You're not getting away. He placed a finger gently on the scar that started just beneath the other boy's collarbone, tracing its jagged path down his stomach. Remus shivered, eyes glazing over. "I've got you, Moony," Sirius thought, a vindictive, triumphant thrill. "So, how was it?" What?" Remus's voice was muffled, foggy. Sirius's fingers skimmed lower. "Sex," he murmured, leaning closer, so that his lips brushed the soft skin at Moony's shoulder. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw Remus's surprised expression. The taller boy squirmed, hips bucking into Sirius's leg. "It was good. She's, so soft, you know? I mean, you know." "Yeah," Sirius breathed, pressing open-mouthed kisses to his neck. He knew very well what Mary was like. She was soft and gentle, and so many things that Sirius could never be. But did she do this, he thought, as a finger worked its way into Remus's belt. Did she know how to touch you like this? Did she do this? This? Did she make you feel like this? Beneath him, Remus made a broken noise in the back of his throat. Sirius pulled back slightly, staring down at him, at his eyes, half-lidded and dark with pupil, at his cheeks, flushed with heat. Remus stared back, through his eyelashes, pliant and debauched and heart-breakingly lovely. Sirius couldn't look away as he licked the palm of his hand. "Like me better," he thought, feverishly, as he slid his hand beneath the waistband of Remus's jeans. "Like me better," as Moony's head fell back onto the pillows, eyes shut, gasping. "Like me better, like me better, like me better." When it was all over, they sat side by side, smoking. Remus inhaled, exhaled. Sirius swallowed and looked away. Chapter 109. 6th Year, The Library. Friday the 4th of March, 1977. Sirius was beginning to think that he had a problem. Well, all right, he knew he had a problem, but before it had at least been a manageable problem, a problem with an end in sight. Remus would get over his old hang-up with girls and find a girlfriend, and their thing, whatever it was, would fade out, naturally. But now things had changed. Now, apparently, Remus had overcome his infuriating martyr complex and decided that he didn't have to hold himself at arm's length to the entire female population of Hogwarts simply because he had convinced himself that he was somehow dangerous. Now he'd shagged Mary, and the two of them had begun spending quite a bit of time together, alone, in the library. They weren't dating. Not officially. In fact, Remus continued to act as though he and Mary were still just friends. But Sirius knew, better than anyone, that friendship with Remus did not necessarily preclude other activities. Every time he saw Remus smile at her, or noticed Mary reaching out to touch his arm, spotted the two of them laughing together, Sirius's heart gave an awful lurch in his chest. He knew it wasn't fair. Remus deserved someone like Mary, someone sunny and joyful and bright. He deserved someone kind, someone sweet, someone who would never hurt him. If Sirius was a better person, he might have accepted that, might have backed away quietly, letting things come to their natural end. But he was not a better person. Sirius was selfish, and no matter how hard he told himself that he should leave Remus alone, he couldn't seem to stop. The problem, as it were, was that Remus didn't seem particularly inclined to stop either. He never initiated anything, of course, that was Sirius's job, but Remus didn't push him away. He didn't draw back, or tell him to stop. In fact, he seemed quite content to allow Sirius to continue, eager even, smiling when Sirius pulled him into bed, or into a broom cupboard, or behind the tapestry, or any one of their usual haunts. Sometimes, with Remus's mouth at his neck, his hands at his waist, his breath in his ear, Sirius could close his eyes and pretend, secretly, that this really was something that Remus wanted. But afterwards, the guilt would always return. The sick feeling that he was using Remus, dragging him like quicksand into the dark pit of his own tainted desire. He would never want this, Sirius told himself, if you hadn't pushed him into it. Sometimes, when he was very tired, or high, or when he had his guard down, a small, answering voice would whisper, "But he's been with Mary, and he still wants you." Sirius strangled it. It was no good having thoughts like that. Insidious, hopeful things. Thoughts that dragged with them a whole host of tangled emotions that Sirius couldn't bear to face. Remus isn't queer, he would remind himself forcefully. And I'm I'm definitely not. On those sorts of days, he would always find himself returning to Emmeline, throwing an arm around her shoulders and flirting shamelessly and tugging her into the fourth-floor girls' loos, where she would giggle when he pressed her up against the wall and kissed her. "Make me feel something," he would beg silently as she slipped her fingers under his shirt. "You're supposed to make me feel something." He hated her a little every time she didn't. He had just spent one such afternoon in Emmeline's arms, trying to forget about the way Remus had groaned when he stood up from the breakfast table that morning, stretching. It hadn't worked, and Sirius was in a sour mood, slouched in front of the fireplace in the common room, when the portrait hole swung open, and the source of all his current problems walked in. "Evans!" James shouted, perking up from his spot on the sofa, because, of course, Remus had waltzed in with his entire entourage of girls. Sirius frowned. Yeah, good evening, Potter," Lily huffed, rolling her eyes. "And Moony," James grinned. "Where have you been?" "Making furious love to us all, obviously." Mary smirked sarcastically, nudging Sirius over and squeezing next to him in front of the fireplace. He stifled a burst of irritation. "It's true." Lily flopped down on the hearth rug, smiling. "He's a stallion." "It took all three of us to satisfy him," Marlene grinned. "Oh my God, please shut up," Remus begged, but he was smiling as he settled down in front of his usual armchair. "We're in the library, so if you didn't know." "Ah, of course." James wiggled his eyebrows. "Say no more, Casanova." Mary shoved her palms in front of the fire, elbowing Sirius in the process. "This castle is freezing." "Scotland is freezing," Sirius muttered, slouching down even further and levitating a paper plane over their heads, just to keep his hands busy. "It's only March," Lily said cheerfully. "It'll start warming up soon enough. I can't wait for the summer." "Nah, then it'll be too hot," Mary groaned. "Our flat is ridiculous, even if you open the windows. Suppose I can do magic this year, though. Am I allowed to if my family are muggles?" "Oh, I do," Lily said nervously. "Are we not supposed to?" "Why don't you just come stay with me, Mary?" Marlene suggested. "More room at our house. It's cooler." "Well, I wouldn't mind a holiday," Mary said thoughtfully, rubbing her hands together. "Haven't had one since Dad lost his job. We used to go to the seaside every year. Margate or Skegness." "Ooh, I went to Cornwall last year," Lily smiled. "It was lovely. We camped right near the beach." "Camping again." Sirius flicked his wand, sending the plane into a nosedive. "Don't get Potter started." But it was too late. "Evans, have I ever told you how much I love camping?" James tossed his golden snitch from hand to hand, grinning like a lunatic. "It's one of my greatest pleasures in life." "I'm talking about muggle camping, Potter," Lily sniffed, glancing away from him. "In muggle tents. No fancy extension charms." "Well, it can't be that different," James chirped, still grinning. "These two haven't even been camping." He jerked his head towards Remus and Sirius. "Well, we sort of did, over Christmas," Remus said, looking pointedly at Sirius with a mischievous smile. Despite his simmering irritation, Sirius couldn't stop an answering smile from creeping over his face. "Hey!" James exclaimed in his familiar "I've just had the most brilliant idea ever" voice. "We should all go camping." "What?" Sirius sat up. "Over the summer," James continued eagerly. "It's our last summer before we'll have to be grown-ups. And we'll all be of age. We should do it." "All of us?" Marlene asked, glancing at Mary. "All of us," James nodded. "What do you think, Evans?" "Well," Lily eyed his manic smile. "Separate tents for boys and girls, right?" "You're no fun," Mary teased. From her spot on the floor, Lily kicked her in retaliation. "Okay, Potter." Her green eyes danced with mischief, a slow smile creeping across her face. "On one condition." "Anything." "Muggle tents." "Oh." Saturday the 5th of March, 1977. If you are 17 years of age or will turn 17 before or on the 31st of August 1977, you are eligible for a 12-week course of apparition lessons from the Ministry of Magic Apparition Instructor, beginning on Monday the 4th of April 1977. Please sign below if you would like to participate. Cost 12 galleons. Remus sighed as he read the notice on Gryffindor Common Room's board, frowning. I'll lend you the money, Sirius offered. I'd rather you didn't. Remus, I'm ridiculously rich. I'm quite aware of that, the other boy snapped, frowning even more deeply at the board. Sirius waited for a moment, watching Remus scan the words again. Okay, he sighed, finally. But I'll pay you back. I really will. I know. Sirius grinned and nudged him. You're going to be making more money than any of us one day, you big swat. Ha! Remus shook his head. Not likely, unless Dumbledore gets his act together. Dumbledore? What's he got to do with anything? Remus paused, glancing around the room. It wasn't all that busy, but there were a few scattered students working on homework or playing games of gobstones near the fire. I can't tell you, he murmured. Upstairs. Sirius raised his eyebrows pointedly with an angelic smile, and Remus began to laugh. He shook his head. Not for that. Get your mind out the gutter, Black. Sirius followed him upstairs, shutting the door behind them as they entered the empty room. James was out patrolling, and Peter was serving a detention with Filch for getting caught out of bounds after curfew. So, Sirius settled onto Remus's bed, asking, What's going on with Dumbledore? Remus sat down as well, leaving a careful distance between them. You remember I had that dinner with Virox, after I met Livia? Yeah, of course. Sirius swallowed. They hadn't spoken about what had happened after the werewolf, not since his outburst the day after. Okay, well, don't get angry with me, but I sort of made some demands on Dumbledore. Sirius blinked, waiting for him to continue. Demands? They had no idea what that was supposed to mean. Remus swallowed, saying, I told him if they wanted me to help them, if they want me to be like an emissary for the werewolves or whatever, then I wanted something in return. Protection for the others in Greyback's pack, first of all. What? Sirius opened his mouth to speak, but then hesitated, remembering James's words. Just listen to him, if he talks to you. After a moment, he shut his mouth. Just listen. Remus eyed him warily, but continued speaking. And I've asked not to be forced to sign the register on my birthday. Well, that's reasonable at least. Sirius released a breath. But Moony, the other thing. I know, Remus said quickly. They're murderers, some of them. I know that. But I don't think they know any other way. I think that if we want to show them that there are choices out there, better ways to live, then that has to start with kindness. Kindness, Sirius said slowly. Not forgiveness, Remus explained. I'm not saying that they should go completely unpunished, but, I mean, you have to admit the Ministry has handled the lycanthropy pretty poorly so far. When we win this war, there's a chance to make things better, for all wizards, even half-breeds. Sirius studied him, the light flickering in his eyes, the determined line of his mouth. He had never seen Remus like this before, passionate and purposeful and adamant, voice fervent as he spoke about a cause that was much bigger than any one person. This is really important to you, isn't it? Yes, Remus responded immediately, without hesitation. You'll have to convince a lot of people. I know. Sirius took a breath. We'll help you, though, he said, eyes still tangled in Moony's burning gaze. Me, and Peter, and James. Evans too, probably. That girl worships you. I couldn't ask. You don't need to, Sirius interrupted him, leaning forwards. His heart felt swollen in his chest. He didn't think before kissing him, once, gently. Anything for our Moony. Later that day, Sirius stood outside the library. He hadn't brought the invisibility cloak with him, this time. It was a Saturday afternoon, so he knew it wouldn't be very crowded. Plus, all of his friends were busy. Remus was hosting his study club in the Charms classroom. Potter was out at some prefects' meeting with Evans, and Peter had gone off to his new girlfriend, Dorcas Meadows. Sirius had no clue how he'd managed that, but he was just relieved that it had put an end to Peter's moping about being over with Desdemona, who had broken up with him shortly after Christmas. So he didn't have to worry about anyone that he knew coming along. At least, he didn't think he did. But as Sirius stood stiffly outside the wide doorway, he was horrified to hear a familiar voice calling his name. "Sirius!" He spun around, stomach sinking. Sure enough, Mary was trotting down the hall, a thick stack of books in her arms. "Macdonald," he said weakly, forcing a smile. It wasn't that he didn't want to see Mary. Sirius liked Mary. She was one of his best friends, aside from the Marauders. It was just that lately, any time he looked at her, he thought of Remus and her perfume on his pillow. And he especially didn't want to see her now, when he was frozen outside the library, sweating and trying to remember how to force his legs to move. "You all right?" Mary asked, squinting up at him. "You look a bit pale." "Fine," Sirius responded, stiffly. Mary hummed, glancing through the doorway at the bookshelves, then back to him. After a moment of rather tense silence, she said slowly, "Are you going in?" "Yes." More silence. Mary studied his face, and Sirius sucked in a shallow breath, wishing she would just sod off. "Well, come on then." She shuffled her books over to one arm, reaching out and winding their fingers together. "Let's go together." Sirius didn't protest as she tugged him over the threshold, forcing himself to keep breathing. His heart pounded against his ribcage like it was trying to crack through bone and escape. "I've just got to return these. It'll only take a minute." Mary smiled up at him, pulling Sirius with her towards the checkout desk. And he was fine. He was perfectly fine. Except that the shelves were so tall, towering, inescapable walls closing in on him, and it was so dark. "Mary?" The shelves were everywhere. Everywhere he looked, he couldn't get away. He had to leave. He could feel his mother's breath on his neck. "Mary!" She stopped, pausing to look up at him again. "Sirius?" "I need to leave." "What?" I need to go. Right now, please." "Okay. Okay, come on, I'll just..." She dumped her books unceremoniously onto a table, spinning around. "Let's go, then." It took every ounce of self-control that Sirius had not to run out of the doors, and by the time they burst back out into the corridor, he was panting, sucking in jagged breaths of air. "Sirius?" Mary still had her fingers wrapped in his, and she squeezed his hand anxiously. "Black, you all right?" He ripped his hand away, shoving his palms against his eyes. "Fuck!" he gasped, trying desperately to hold himself together. "Fuck, I'm sorry, it's just..." "Hey, it's okay. You don't need to apologize." Now Mary was rubbing his back, small, soothing circles. "I shouldn't have just dragged you in there like that. I am sorry." Sirius shook his head, releasing a breathy, humourless laugh. "It's not your fault," he muttered, leaning back against the wall. "Fuck." They were quiet for a bit. Mary leaned against the wall next to him, arms crossed. When he was no longer breathing quite so heavily, she said carefully, I'm assuming you don't want to talk about it." Sirius shook his head, and they fell silent again. Then, "Greenhouses?" He looked down, and she was smiling up at him impishly. Despite himself, he laughed. "Merlin, Macdonald. I don't know what I ever did to deserve you."